The Ukrainians hunted down the Russian paratrooper forces in the forests of Sumy. Those men whom the Kiev operators faced, whose corpses now lay on the ground, were very different from the elite soldiers that Moscow sent at the beginning of the conflict. In 2022, the 106th Airborne Division was portrayed as one of Russia's elite units. Trained paratroopers, helicopters over Kiev, advancing as if victory was inevitable. But after years of war in Ukraine, this force has changed. In Bakhmut, Kursk, and Sumy, the soldiers who once symbolized power started crawling through trenches, forests, and even suffocating gas pipelines, hunted by Ukrainian drones. This is the story of how the Russian airborne elite was turned into disposable infantry, and how names like Badyanov and Golovkin reveal the true cost of this war. Ukrainian special forces made a difficult journey to the Russian trenches. They walked among the craters, then through the bushes, trying to find the enemies. They knew there were paratroopers from the 106th Airborne Division, sometimes called the Tula Paratroopers, a unit famous for recruiting men from Ryazan and Tula, cities relatively close to Moscow. The fighting started in the middle of dense woods. There was so much vegetation that it was hard to see where to aim the rifle. Some shots were fired just to keep the enemy in a defensive position as the attack continued. Slowly, the soldiers moved through the water, camouflaged in their special outfits. The rifle shots came closer and closer to Russian flesh. Once they finished one trench, they circled around to find another part of the target in the same defensive system. The strategy was the same. Gunfire cracked through the trees in the woods.
Next, the soldiers circled around to the target.
Next, the soldiers circled the target. At the end of the fighting at that position, they received information that there were Russians in a nearby settlement. They had to take care of the wounded before carrying out the orders. Only after their comrade was evacuated did they proceed to the next mission. They had to clear a farm that had already witnessed war before the special forces arrived. Now, with grenades rolling down the stairs, the place would see more destruction and death. The explosives were thrown to flush out or kill the Russians. A quick death for the enemies was preferable. But if possible, at the very least, the soldiers needed the enemies to be cornered so they could enter the house with less risk. Gradually, the Ukrainian operators began to surround the targets inside the ruins. It seemed that they had fled into what was left of the house. A grenade flew into the room ahead. After the explosion, they raked the place with gunfire. The Ukrainians entered through the smoke, still firing. The group began clearing each room, always covering their comrades' backs. Once the action was over, they left the bodies behind and began their return to the command center. Among the Russian soldiers the Ukrainians were facing were regiments from the 106th Airborne Division. This used to be an elite unit. But when men like Golovkin Alexander Andreevich and Badyanov Vladimir Vladimirovich volunteered to fight and became part of it, a lot had changed. Especially in the case of Badyanov. His record showed very clearly the state of the 106th Division after years of war. In 2022, they were still elite. They were sent practically as the spearhead, ahead of everyone, to take important positions in the direction of Kiev. Their helicopters flew over Ukrainian cities, striking terror into the hearts of civilians and soldiers. They were a swarm of destruction passing over Ukraine like a plague of locusts over a rich crop. The armored columns advanced deep into Ukraine, often without public intervention. The enemy's job was easy. The elite troops didn't seem to have much trouble taking control of the road to Kyiv. The artillery was set up near the capital, starting the bombardment against the Ukrainian defenses. The troops were motivated. They were soldiers trained for years, some experienced from other conflicts like Syria. When the Ukrainians tried to send their own armored columns, the Russian airborne troops waited for the opportunity, destroying the Ukrainian tanks and BMPs with artillery, while the drone watched the attacks slowly break apart, filling the field with burning metal structures. The attack failed catastrophically. The Russian airborne troops kept advancing, but after some time, the Ukrainian response came. In these large columns, the tanks, BMPs, and BTRs started to burn during these big displays of power. These were signs that military power was no longer just an elite force sweeping enemies aside from atop armored vehicles. Golovkin and Badyanov would later become, each in their own way, symbols of the fate of the Russian elite. The 106th Airborne Division did not have it easy during the following years of combat in Ukraine. Some of its regiments were ordered to support the Wagner Group in the fighting in Bakhmut. Badyanov knew about this. He was not among the troops yet. In those days, he couldn't have been. A lot would have to change for a man like Badyanov to be accepted into the Russian elite. He had something that would never allow him to be part of those forces anywhere. That's another story. The 106th Division fought in the Battle of Bakhmut, which is repeatedly mentioned in the history of the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. It's impossible not to do so, because that's where the strategy of sending small waves of soldiers to break through the Ukrainian defenses was established. Drones gained prominence, dropping explosives on defensive positions. Fighting in muddy trenches claimed the lives of hundreds of soldiers. Bakhmut fell in 2023, and the following years would be spent by the Russians to cover the 14 kilometers needed to capture Kraken-BR. Yes, years of attrition to cover 14 kilometers, years of men fighting and dying. In 2025, Badyanov was inspired to enlist after he saw the fighting to liberate Kursk from Ukrainian forces. At that time, Kiev's troops had invaded a small portion of Russia and taken the territory quickly. Badyanov volunteered and was accepted to his surprise. He could hardly contain his happiness that, despite his problem, he could now join the elite of the Russian armed forces. The fighting in Kursk was tough. The Russians focused on destroying Ukrainian logistics, wiping out the supply network that kept the troops inside Russia. Badyanov helped push the Ukrainians beyond Sudzha, forcing them back across the borders. One of the highlights of this event was when the troops of the 100th Airborne Division decided to use one of the main gas metering and transfer stations of the Urengoy-Pomary-Uzhhorod pipeline, which historically transported Russian gas to Europe through Ukrainian territory. The Veterans Brigade manually dug a camouflage tunnel about 500 meters long just to reach the entry point of the pipeline without being detected by Ukrainian reconnaissance drones. The pipeline spent the day being ventilated to expel the remaining residual natural gas. Even so, the air inside was still dangerous. The oxygen was scarce, heavy, and fought over with every breath. The soldiers were instructed to keep at least 10 meters apart from each other so they wouldn't consume the little remaining oxygen too quickly. In several sections, they had to use gas masks, moving forward inside a narrow, stifling pipe where each step seemed to drain more strength from them. Badyanov heard about men who didn't make it. Some suffocated, others died from poisoning inside the pipes. Still, the column kept moving forward. Bent inside pipes about 1.4 meters in diameter, the Russians traveled between 15 and 16 kilometers through the underground darkness, breathing fear, metal, and suffocation. According to the Russians, 800 fighters broke through the pipeline behind the Ukrainian armed forces near Sudzha. It was almost torture to go through those suffocating pipes. Breathing fresh air again was priceless. The Ukrainians noticed part of this movement, sending their troops to hunt down the Russians who came out exhausted from inside the pipes. Death spread among these groups. Drones and artillery forced the men to breathe the hot smoke from the explosions. Dozens were killed. However, chaos had already been created. The maneuver destabilized the defensive pocket of Suja, culminating in the withdrawal and collapse of Ukrainian forces in Kursk province throughout that month. Badyanov was on offer. Someone like him was part of the elite that was driving the Ukrainians out of Mother Russia. He used to be a chess player, but now he was fighting a war off the chessboard. The battles, however, were not over yet. When the invasion of Sumy began, the Ukrainian arm on the border with Kursk, Badyanov, and the 106th Airborne Division were there, facing the resistance from Kiev. The Ukrainian special forces were sent to surround the forward groups. They were tense moments of battle, which sometimes ended with Kiev's operators surrounding the Russians in holes and forcing their surrender. Several of these men were forced to surrender, lying down in a row until they were identified. These troops moved quickly, flanking the Russians and surprising many of them in the forests of Sumy. Quickly, the rifles began to fire, shooting until there was no response. Grenades were thrown over long distances. The RPGs blew up the Russian invaders. Some of them surrendered. Their heat signatures glowed among the trees with their hands raised. Surveillance systems were destroyed in the Russian rear area, reducing the likelihood of Ukrainian drones and soldiers being detected during these rapid movements. The Russians responded with bombs. Badyanov had already been at war for months, witnessing the destruction that the Russians were capable of causing in the villages where the Ukrainians were hiding. Moscow's kamikaze drones dove into the Ukrainian trenches, exploding one after another among the trees. The Ukrainians were trapped in the middle of the forest. Shaken, they had to deal with Moscow's troops approaching. First, grenades exploded nearby, then rifles started taking down Kiev's defenders. The Russians surrounded the pair of Ukrainians, firing while taking cover behind the trees. When the last one finally fell, they moved in to check the bodies. Badyanov kept moving forward. It wasn't easy for him. He was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when he was just 12 years old. He was happy that, despite that, he had been accepted into the elite of the Russian airborne troops. The training was short, but he was ready to hunt the Ukrainians. His own immune system had destroyed his pancreas. Without producing insulin, he needed daily injections to control his blood sugar. His diet had to be carefully managed. In certain extreme efforts during the war, there was always the risk of collapsing because of this dysregulation. Furthermore, some combat wounds took much longer to heal and had a high risk of gangrene or serious infections. Even so, he watched the Russians drop bombs on the Ukrainians and was prepared to continue fighting. The Ukrainian special forces kept moving, even with so many Russian explosions trying to kill them. They stepped carefully between the trees, avoiding the noise of breaking branches. The men signaled when they encountered the first Russian in the middle of the forest. The rifle was aimed, the trigger was pulled, and in response, a cry of pain announced another Russian casualty in the war. After that, silence also died, with rifles firing in succession at the soldiers from Moscow. A started to become A itself. He will set himself up around. The Ukrainians approached the bodies, looking for identification. Then they left, leaving the Russian bodies behind and taking their farewells, and went to Moscow with the Russians left behind, taking new information to their command. Badyanov passed away in 2025, He enlisted to become part of the elite, but ended up being just a pawn on the battlefield. When the 106th was filling its ranks with whatever material was offered to it, often the material that would be easily discarded in poorly planned attacks, it ended up on a stalled front when the 106th Division was already being used as light infantry, sent into combat like any other group within Moscow's forces. Golovkin already knew this when he became part of the airborne troops. There was nothing airborne about it. And the orders was simply to crawl on the ground. That would change his life. The Russian drone flew into the Ukrainian hideout. The propellers spun in the air, moving quickly until the FPV finally exploded and set fire to the place where the Ukrainian soldiers were hiding. These strikes were searching for the Ukrainian defenses, trying to expand a difficult part of the front. Their fast flights hit the enemies in their defensive positions, but they were also looking for the soldiers' rotation lines or the supply routes, trying to repeat what had happened in Kursk. Golovkin saw how the artillery roared in Sumy, attacking the Ukrainians, sometimes even from within the neighboring Russian oblast, and hitting several enemy soldiers. The FAB bombs kept exploding. The Russians tried to push since the beginning of 2026. Their planes worked hard to drop these heavy explosives against the Ukrainians. There was no way to survive when one of these bombs hit the defenses directly. Only twisted bodies remained in the middle of the churned and burned earth. Golovkin was impressed by the accuracy of many of these attacks. The bombs glided for miles before falling like divine fury on the Ukrainian hideouts. It was a terrible sight for a soldier, at least terrible for a Ukrainian soldier. Not for Golovkin, who just watched the destruction and then marched in to check the damage. The teams using the KON-TGM also moved between the tree lines, guiding the missiles to detonate over the entrenched Ukrainians. Golovkin advanced and gathered information, providing support to these groups. If he managed to spot the Ukrainians, a new target was relayed and placed under drone surveillance. The mortar teams had to get very close to aim at their targets. The calculations were made based on the drone coordinates before the ammunition was placed inside the tubes and finally fired to destroy the enemy defenses. Everything seemed to be going well until an order came for the 106th. Golovkin's unit was supposed to repeat the Kursk operation, going through the toxic tubes to break through the Ukrainian defense in Sumy and finally make the front move. More supplies. Then they started walking hunched over, breathing heavily inside that claustrophobic environment. But now when they came out, the Ukrainians were already waiting. The drones started hunting the soldiers. The explosions took down men who were already struggling to breathe as they ran. The field was saturated with explosions. Rows of these soldiers were detected walking through the snow. After that, it was enough to send the aerial demons after them and begin the slaughter. Baba Yaga drones roamed the region, dropping explosives on soldiers who had nowhere to go. The hunt was too easy. There was nowhere to hide. The tension grew among the men like molten gold. The orders seemed meant for another moment of glory. But now beneath the drones there was only hell and death. There were dozens of men being hunted in the fields. It didn't matter which part of the tube they came out of. They were caught by the Ukrainians. Alone or in groups, they were visited by death. It was all too quick. Every time they tried to cross the lines that would decide the battle in Sumy, they ended up being spotted by drones. The Ukrainians didn't even send their men. They just waited with their aerial plagues to blow up the invaders. This was done more than once. The suffocating environment wasn't enough, nor was the horrible smell saturating their lungs. They had to deal with the horror of the drones as soon as they set foot on the cold ground again. The brief moments of fresh air were replaced by the terror of having to take deep breaths in order to run and escape from the threats that bombarded them or exploded in their kamikaze dives. The Russian soldier could be brave. Men like Golovkin had been lured in by propaganda and the promise of good pay. But they faced a greater challenge than the Ukrainians, overcoming the orders of incompetent leaders. More than once, the pipeline strategy was attempted, all with the same result. The Ukrainians were waiting for them and massacred them. It seemed special to be part of a troop with that kind of mission, but in the end, they would be finished. Pawns thrown in to repeat the same move over and over, always trying to get it right at some point. The operation killed hundreds of Russians, and it didn't change the southern front. It remained practically stagnant, about 15 kilometers gained after a year of battle. In the end, Golovkin didn't die because of the Ukrainians. They were just carrying out the order given by Moscow's own officers. It was their leaders who failed, sending well-trained soldiers under poorly planned orders until finally they no longer had those brave men at their disposal, men who had been forged for war at great cost. The 106th, the pride and elite of the airborne troops, was now reduced to that. A bunch of men trained for 2 to 3 weeks, sent to the front in waves until death had its hands too full to claim any more victims. So the ones the Reaper couldn't take would advance and seize more parts of Ukraine. Golovkin was not among them. Death had hands that were too big. Many souls could fit between those skeletal fingers.